Hello, everyone. I hope that you're super excited for this month's Global Hack Week. We're doing Web3 this Global Hack Week, and I think this is the first workshop of the week, so I'm really excited. Before we get started, I'm going to give everyone a minute to fill out the form. I sent a link in the chat. That's just to register your attendance with Major League Hacking. But how's everyone doing today? Awesome. Looks like we have a good amount of people, and seems like there's a good amount of excitement. I'm excited too. Yeah, so I think we're going to get started. So today we're talking about the legal and ethical aspects of Web3. This is a pretty new topic because the concepts of Web3 and like traditional like legal precedent are like pretty at odds with each other, as like we'll get into in just a minute. But I think it's a very interesting topic. So today we're going to be covering a few different topics within legal and ethical aspects of Web3. So first off, I'll start off with an introduction. We'll talk a little bit about Global Hack Week and just like an overview of Web3 and crypto as a whole. And then after that, we're going to kind of start diving into the legal framework for Web3 as well as ethical considerations. And for both the legal framework as well as ethical considerations, we have a case study to kind of walk through a real life example of something that could happen. They're like not based on like things that have happened, but more, I guess, like speculative. And it kind of shows you the concepts applied to like the real world and how Web3 operates. And then after that, I have some additional links if you're curious to hear more about different case studies or just like learning more about Web3 and the different legal and ethical frameworks around the world because it changes drastically by country. Yes, so my name is Gabriella. I'm a coach here at Major League Hacking. I'm also a senior majoring in information technology. Typically, I usually focus on web development and design stuff, but I'm pretty interested in kind of the intersection between like legal stuff as well as like ethics with crypto. I got interested in it when talking to my uncle who used to do prosecution for different cases for the government, and a lot of them started to involve crypto for money laundering or cases of human trafficking. So it was interesting to hear about a new perspective because I'm so, I guess, like involved with like the technical aspects of stuff. So here we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction to Web3. We're going to do a little bit of an overview of blockchain technology as well as cryptocurrency. I'm not sure what the familiarity is like in the crowd, so if you could put something in the chat about anything you know about Web3 or crypto in general. Okay, it looks like we have a few beginners. Yes, looks like there's a lot of beginners, people who don't know much about Web3. And I think that's pretty common because there's a lot of, I guess, like buzzwords and stuff in the news or on social media about Web3 and like a little bit, but not too much about the actual technologies and regulation. Yes. Okay, so some of the key components of Web3 are blockchain technology, decentralization, as well as cryptocurrency and tokens. So a little bit about blockchain technology. What makes it so novel is that it's transparent, tamper-proof, and the data storage and transactions are immutable. So typically with Web 2, like what we're kind of used to now, you're able to change and alter the data types a little bit more easily because it's not immutable and super embedded into the technology, and everything doesn't build on each other in our current system, if that makes sense. And second, the other core component is decentralization. Web3 is built on decentralized networks. That's one of the main components. And the reason that this is so popular is because it reduces the reliance that the internet would have on a single institution, government, authority, etc. So rather than having so much like reliance on like US government or like a tech company like Google or Amazon or something like that, it relies on individual networks that are kind of decentralized and interconnected. And then finally, the last key component of cryptocurrency and tokens. This implements the concept of decentralized finance through micropayments and peer-to-peer transactions, cutting out the middleman. So there's less, like we talked about earlier, of the institutions kind of involved in that. Yes, so kind of diving deeper into blockchain. So when it was first used, it was in the 1970s, and it was just by the military for encryption and keeping data very safe, but wasn't really used by the general public or even technologists as a whole until the 90s, when there was a group of hackers called the cypherpunks who believed that cryptography would kind of allow for more freedom and sovereignty on the internet for kind of the average user. At the time, this group really didn't like how much the government had power over technology and data privacy. The powers kind of changed since then. A lot of the power and, I guess, control of technology has shifted from governmental organizations into more large corporations and tech conglomerates. But in the 90s, this group created some early attempts at like electronic cash, kind of precursors to Bitcoin and Ethereum. And these were known as hash cash and digicash. And then shortly after that, in 2008, is when the Bitcoin white paper was posted. And the inventor kind of coined this as an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof rather than trust. So it's more focused on the proof of an electronic payment system in cryptography versus relying on the external organizations or institutions like a government organization, a tech company, or something else. Yes, and here's kind of a visualization of how like the blockchain works. So first, transaction is initiated, and the data is packaged into a specific block, and the block is sent off to other members in the network before becoming embedded and approved in the network by the other blocks, and then it's added into the chain, and the update is distributed, and this process continues with additional transactions and blocks as well. Okay, it looks like we have a few questions in the chat. So for Web 2, do you still use a browser to access Web 3? It kind of depends on what kind of application or technology you're using. So you could be using a web app, you could be using a mobile app, and there's other more local aspects of blockchain as well. It's just kind of like how it interfaces and the decentralization aspect versus the current internet, where it's more focused on connection to other organizations and more centralized. It looks like someone said Web3 is basically the next generation of internet built on blockchain to be more secure and less controlled by big companies. That's correct. Yes, you can still use a browser to check it out, but there's going to be extra technology to kind of gain things. Yes, I will be sharing the slides after this presentation, so don't worry about like taking notes or anything like that. Or screenshots, I'll be sending it in the Discord afterwards. Okay, so kind of moving on to talk more about decentralization. This is kind of the primary purpose of Web3, and that like you're focusing more on the communal consensus of the community of technologists, developers, different users, and like people in the ecosystem. And like kind of versus like the current power, which is like remaining in governing institutions, which in like years past we've seen shift from the actual government to governing happening from large tech companies and different developers. And kind of Ethereum and Bitcoin, as well as different cryptocurrencies, use different proofs for kind of validating the different blocks within the blockchain. So Ethereum and Bitcoin use a proof of work concept, and miners are competing in this concept to solve the different cryptographic problems. And once the miner wins a problem and like is able to solve it the fastest, they're able to add a new block into the blockchain, and then they're in return awarded with the tokens in return for their efforts. And then other like tokens like Ethereum 2, Cardano, Tizo use proof of stake. And this differs from Ethereum and Bitcoin because rather than competing for the cryptographic problems and who can solve them the fastest, they're staking tokens in order to earn the right to become a validator of this blockchain. And these are somewhat chosen at random, but also this stake is kind of chosen based on the size of the blockchain and the specific block, as well as the age. In a miner, someone is asked in the chat, is essentially someone who is validating that this block is being added to the chain and adding new crypto to the network. And additionally, for proof of stake blockchains, the users become responsible for checking to make sure that the transactions in this blockchain are valid, making sure that the date and the order is all correct, and kind of signing off on it before adding it to the blockchain. And in this particular proof model, these users receive transaction fees for completing a stake versus receiving tokens like they would in the proof of work concept. So a little bit more on decentralization, specifically in crypto. Solana, and a few other tokens use proof of history, which is the third type of proof model. And this model attempts to lighten the load of the network nodes by providing more of a sense of encoding time itself into the blockchain versus having to validate it manually. And this is very critical because it tells the network the order of the blocks so that the chain doesn't become messy and disorganized, and making sure the sequence is correct. Okay, someone's asking about the resource links. Those will be at the end of the presentation. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit more into cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin, kind of like to define that as a peer-to-peer version of electronic cash. So rather than sending like US dollars from one person to another, and you have a bank in the middle, whether it be through like Zelle or Venmo, there's multiple different middlemen in the middle executing that transaction. It goes from having like that financial institution as the middleman to individual to individual. And this is within a trustless network of different crypto miners who create this like consensus mechanism to make sure that the date lines up, as well as everything is in order in the block and validating its like the proper validity. Whereas Ethereum is a blockchain with a built-in programming language, which lets like essentially anyone, typically developers who will learn this particular programming language, and they're able to write smart contracts and decentralized apps. And these contracts and apps typically like auto execute, so they follow the rules to execute those peer-to-peer transactions or different transactions within the network. And within Ethereum, the currency within that particular blockchain is Ether. And every time you use a decentralized app built on Ethereum or make a transaction like sending money from one person to another, you pay a small gas fee, which is similar to just like the fees in the other cryptocurrencies. The reason that they have implemented these fees in order, like on the blockchain network, is to prevent spam on the network, because the whole point is that you cannot reverse or alter the data after the transaction has occurred and like the block has been added to the blockchain. This gas fee is essentially to prevent spam, so that the blockchain remains relatively clean. And Ethereum also uses proof of concept. Someone asked, what's required to become a miner? I don't know. I haven't looked into that in particular. I know that there's a few different ways you can get into it, but I do not know. Does the gas fee go to the miner? In some transactions, it does, and then for the like decentralized apps, that will go to like the developers and the people owning the app. Okay. Each addition to the blockchain certifies that different users have held the coin that yes. So the certification is essentially connecting the different addresses to one another, as well as the date and making sure all of the information is valid. So Web3 software development versus kind of like what we know software development as it like exists today essentially is just like the decentralized aspect and relying more on languages within Web3 and making like the blockchain data model versus stuff that we currently have in like Google Cloud or um, like Azure, stuff like that. A lot of it, like the concepts will be very similar to just, like software engineers today, just kind of applying new technologies, kind of like when you're utilizing knowledge you've gained as a web developer, kind of translating it into mobile development. Yes, there are differences, and some of them are like pretty significant, but the concepts are relatively the same. And just like altering like the data structure or just kind of like the configuration of the application. Okay. So now I'm going to dive a little bit more into kind of the evolution from Web 1 and Web 2. Web 2 is kind of what we know today into Web 3. As you can see, all three of these like different blocks have a little subheader of read write, and read write own. And that's essentially the different actions that users are taking on the internet at that time. So Web 1 is kind of the first iteration of the internet. What we remember in the 90s to the early 2000s of users being more passive consumers of content. Web was very static on the internet. You would have videos, photos, but not much interaction of uploading those yourself or like the interaction you have on social media today. It was more just like reading and like the static pages on that. And more people had personal kind of web pages because of that. You weren't able to have like an Instagram, like a YouTube presence because it was all static. So you would have to do it yourself kind of through a personal web page. And kind of what we're in now is Web 2, which is the subtitle is read write. This is where we currently are, and the subtitle is read write because the action we're currently taking is there's a good amount of static content on the internet right now. But there is also a lot of that interactivity you have with social media as well as just different websites where you're able to interact with it a lot easier. Less people have those personal web pages because you're able to kind of fulfill that social media and kind of sharing needs through a third party where it's more interactive. You can leave like the comments, likes, sharing things, and aren't having to do all that code on your own. Um, and in this kind of shift from Web 1 to Web 2, we saw more of a shift in power from governmental organizations for like disseminating information and things like that to the large tech companies. So like the Google, Amazon, like Meta, etc. And kind of what we're starting to shift into now is Web3, which is read, write, own. And this is kind of moving the interactivity we currently have of the current internet into a model where the users have more ownership of the internet. So, kind of as a collective, the users are able to kind of contribute and decide on data storage, the validation of data, and making sure that things are more transparent than they currently are now. This is more emerging. It's not as present like across the whole internet. It's more future based and very based on decentralized networks. Okay, it looks like we have some questions in the comments. Can we have Web 4 beyond? What difference will it be? I think that's like very theoretical at this point. Like someone said in the comments, I think because Web3 right now is still very speculative for a lot of applications. It's not really fully implemented in our internet today. So that's kind of, I guess, the future that's currently being built, where Web 4 is just more, I guess, the more distant ideas built upon Web 3 and changes that will like happen after Web 3 has been implemented kind of across the board. Okay. So kind of someone said that Web3 isn't a standard yet. So Web4 will like have to be worked on, and that is true. Once Web3 is kind of implemented across the board, Web4 will kind of become the more speculative, like future thinking aspect of the internet. And I think that kind of the periods of the internet will kind of always happen. I think there's always going to be some sort of innovation, and over time, like whether it be like 10, 15, 20 years, the way we interact with the internet and the overall functions, I think, will continue to change as technology changes, as well as our needs to interact with the internet and different technology change as well. So now we're going to kind of talk in about the legal framework for Web3. As I mentioned earlier, it's a very interesting concept because traditional legal frameworks, specifically in the US, are kind of at odds with like all the concepts of Web3, whereas Web3 is very decentralized. Not very many identities are tied to transactions or profiles. It's very much at odds with the legal frameworks of needing to like validate customers and like audits. It makes things very challenging. Okay, so kind of an overview of like the regulatory landscape that exists today. There's like a lot of different regulations across the board just because due to the nature of Web3, it's an international phenomenon and kind of goes across lots of different like jurisdictions, and they all handle it very differently. So how they handle it in the EU is going to be very different from in the US versus like the regulations in Japan, etc. And this can kind of lead to just like a lot of different regulations, but also the need for different countries, jurisdictions, states to kind of like cooperate for together to address different things that go wrong. So if like there's a hack or for as we'll talk about in in a few minutes, kind of when like there's like online hacks or different technology issues and kind of how the decentralized nature and different regulations kind of play into that. Secondly, we're going to talk about AML and KYC compliance. These are applied to crypto exchanges and wallet providers, and this is done to limit illicit activities. These are very heavily applied in traditional financial institutions and are starting to be implemented in crypto financial institutions like decentralized finance. But because of the nature of decentralization, it has proven to be pretty challenging, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then third, data privacy is a big issue in the regulatory landscape because balancing the transparency of the blockchain with personal data privacy, especially in some jurisdictions where the data privacy is more strict, can be proved to be a very like complex legal question. And then lastly, DAOs are also a very interesting and challenging legal question because they kind of blur the traditional legal entities of a company or a person and like the decentralized protocol that's core to a DAO. Yeah, some people were asking what AML was. It is related to anti-money laundering. We'll get a little bit more into that in a few minutes. So first, we're going to kind of talk about the diversity of regulations. Like the different regulations very much vary by the different jurisdictions, state, country, etc. But there are some common traits that appear in a lot of different countries, a lot of different states and governing bodies. So the AML and KYC regulation is very common, and this is to prevent money laundering, fraud, just kind of making sure that illicit activities are being caught and prevented in these like new decentralized financial methods. Specifically in the European Union, they recently passed the fifth anti-money laundering directive. And this requires crypto service providers to register and comply with these different regulations that traditional financial institutions have been following for a very long time. And it's a very strict audit and compliance process. So these are being applied to the same. It's being applied as well to cryptocurrency. And additionally, the EU is working on a comprehensive regulatory framework for digital assets and blockchain technology. And this is to kind of work on the taxation model and how they want to treat it, because a lot of different places want to treat cryptocurrency differently. Some want to treat it as stocks. Some want to treat NFT. Like, there's the question of, should an NFT be treated as art? And the taxation and like asset laws that are usually applied to that. Do we need to kind of develop completely new laws for these new financial models? Switzerland is very cryptocurrency friendly. This will be probably unsurprising to a lot of people because of kind of Switzerland's overall laws for money and finance tend to be a little bit more relaxed than other countries. And they also offer a pretty clear legal framework for token sales, which has led to Switzerland having a lot of blockchain startups and a pretty thriving startup scene there. Japan views crypto as legal tender. I didn't get to do too much research into this, but I thought that was interesting. And China has banned many crypto activities within the country, but records still show that there's billions in crypto transactions occurring within China. Okay, so next we're going to kind of move into the AML and KYC regulation, which we talked about previously, and kind of dive more into what they specifically mean, as well as what they are attempting to prevent. So they both kind of serve as prevention against fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing. Kind of in addition to that, something that's been popping up recently more and more is cryptocurrency being used as a currency for human trafficking, and it makes it very difficult in those investigations to kind of track down culprits because of the money laundering that occurs during that. So, enforcing these regulations of AML and KYC regulation can help to crack down on those different infractions. So AML stands for anti-money laundering regulation, and it exists to detect and prevent cleaning money from dirty money, which is illegally obtained money, into clean or legal money. So a few different things that are required of financial institutions within the AML regulation is to do customer due diligence. And that's pretty much to ensure that you know your customers and have information on them, making sure that financial institutions are transaction monitoring. So what you would see at a traditional financial institution, where they have fraud detection and making sure that suspicious activity is reported both to someone who, for example, maybe got their credit card stolen and someone's buying like $700 worth of pizza on it, or the transaction just doesn't make sense and looks like it's tied to illegal activity. And that kind of ties into suspicious activity reporting, making sure that those are all kind of above board and preventing fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing. KYC stands for Know Your Customer regulation. And this is essentially financial institutions verifying that they actually know their customers, and that their customers are who they claim to be. So this requires financial institutions to collect information such as a customer's name, their date of birth, their address, a passport or driver's license, in the US, a social security number. And this KYC regulation prevents identity theft. So someone finding your social security number and just taking over all your finances, or just someone gaining unauthorized access, fraud, as well as this really assists in criminal investigations because it makes it more difficult for different organizations or individuals who are breaking different laws to clean their money that's been obtained illegally, or just access lines of credit, etc. Okay, looks like there's a few questions in the chat. So EvoSkill asked, doesn't KYC and AML ruin the can't be tracked feature of crypto? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of decentralized transactions, as in all transactions are monitored? That's a very interesting point, and one that's very core to kind of the questions that are being asked about cryptocurrency. and the current legal framework, because the current legal framework for investigating different financial crimes is so tied to identity. And these things are very key to figuring out like what's going on, but it's at odds with the very purpose of these technologies. So something that some crypto like technology professionals have been talking about is decentralized identity tracking. So keeping personal information off the blockchain and somehow like loosely connected for the institutions such as an exchange, but we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. Someone asked if the government makes regulations and rules to Web3, then what's the difference between Web2 when it's being controlled heavily? I think the main difference is that even if these regulations exist, still the power of Web3 kind of exists more in the hands of the users as a collective versus a company or the government. Even if the government has those regulations that need to be followed, it's not there's not the same level of control as it being from a government entity or being completely controlled by a large tech company, but more as a collective. The users are complying with these regulations and the transparency to make sure there's not any corruption or fraud. Someone said that El Salvador was the first country to accept crypto as legal tender in 2021. I did not know that. That's interesting to know. Yes. Okay. So kind of moving on, we're going to talk about specifically American crypto regulations and a little bit more about AML and KYC regulation. So the SEC views cryptocurrencies as securities and will apply the existing securities laws to these digital assets. So kind of what this means is that if you realize crypto gains or losses, so you sell some crypto through your exchange, you have to report that on your tax return at the end of the year. But different organizations within the government kind of recognize different crypto as different existing financial assets. The CFTC, the Crypto Futures Trading Commission, classified Bitcoin and Ethereum as commodities versus securities. And this particular governmental organization oversees public exchanges. So like Bitcoin derivatives, they're overseeing this to prevent fraud as well as kind of taxation. And then finally, exchanges like Coinbase are currently being governed in the US by the Bank Secrecy Act. And this law oversees the activity of financial institutions. So think your traditional financial institutions as well, such as like a Chase, a Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera. And they're overseeing these financial institutions and the payments, transmissions, and making sure that they all kind of comply with the existing AML and KYC regulations. So we're starting to see these crypto exchanges needing to follow more of the traditional regulations, which proves to be very interesting because they approach their financial models in such a different way than what we have normally seen from financial institutions. And how these regulations are applied to decentralized finance is still a very interesting legal question. Okay. Someone asked, isn't KYC used by banks? Yes, it is. Yes. Okay. Kind of moving on to data privacy within a legal framework. So Web3 is inherently transparent and immutable just based on the data structure and the decentralized aspect of it. And this proves to be like incredibly challenging for legal frameworks, specifically outside of the US, where there's stronger data protections. For example, the data protections in the EU are very strict. And they have a specific law called the right to be forgotten. And this law it proves to be very challenging working within immutable systems of crypto because this clause in the Protection Act essentially allows any EU citizen to completely remove their presence from like a website, an app, etc. If they decide they no longer want their data stored in this, but because of the existing blockchain kind of technology, this makes it very difficult because everything is built on top of one another. So taking out a specific person or user is incredibly challenging, which is why a lot of technologists have talked about the kind of decentralized identification and completely removing identification of people and having it in a separate, essentially, storage model. Um, kind of jumped ahead there, but kind of going back to data privacy as a whole within Web3. This data is called off-chain data, and this is used to store private information that will be needed for like those regulation. Um, so such as like your name, date of birth. It poses some linkability risk if it's not managed properly, but will be required as governments are increasingly imposing these regulations on different crypto exchanges and to Web3 as a whole. And a little bit more about the Web3 technology is that it allows people to be represented by a cryptographic address, but not entirely anonymous. So this kind of allows for more of a balance between data privacy and staying true to the concept of untraceability, immutability, while still being able to navigate the challenging legal framework that goes with financial institutions. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about DAOs, and DAO is the acronym for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. DAO organizations are governed by code and smart contracts, and these smart contracts are kind of like auto-executing. So once the rules have been coded, they just are executing, and these decision-making powers are vested within token holders of the DAO. And these predefined rules are pretty core to a DAO. DAOs are very like challenging to regulate and kind of even bring into a legal framework because it blurs the traditional legal entities of a person, a trust, a company with the decentralized protocols. So the liability for when something goes wrong, such as a data leak, fraud, theft, etc. So liability of who is responsible for kind of like justice when that happens. It might fall on engineers in some case who coded the smart contracts or the decentralized app. Sometimes it falls on the token holders, and other times it falls on different parties who were involved in the DAO. But this also varies by different country, jurisdiction, etc. Some DAOs to kind of like interface with existing legal systems will establish LLCs or different company structures depending on the company to create more of a hybrid approach from Web3 and the existing legal framework. So they're able to kind of have a preventative measures for when something goes wrong, when there's a hack or fraud or unauthorized access, which happens with many different types of technology. And this is found to be a pretty solid middle ground in a lot of cases. Additionally, DAOs at their core are implementing transparency, like disclosure of what they're doing to collect decentralized IDs and different information, as well as the governance mechanisms they need to follow to align with the law. Earlier, someone was asking, how is this going to be different than current existing financial institutions? I think that the transparency is a big part of it because even though there are the legally required disclosures, other information that different banks and traditional financial institutions give out, with transparency and disclosure being so at the core of Web3 technology, I think it will be inherently different even as they follow those financial regulations that will begin to be more and more imposed as time goes on. And I think that for DAOs in particular, proactivity is really going to simplify their interactions with the law by establishing something like an LLC or different governmental structures, or maybe even having different token holders be solely responsible for that or primarily responsible for what happens with the smart contracts. Okay, so now we've kind of gone through a lot of the theoretical aspects of with it, a lot of the theoretical legal aspects of Web3. So now we're going to kind of go into an application of this. This is a case study for a decentralized market. I'm going to kind of walk through who this is affecting, what happened in this hypothetical situation, and kind of what we can learn from that for the legal landscape of Web3. So in this case study, who we're talking about is Decentral Market, and this is a Web3 project that gained a lot of popularity due to its like decentralized and anonymous nature. You're able to add pseudonyms. You can kind of think of it like a Web3 Facebook Marketplace, eBay, etc. There's digital storefronts. You're able to list products and pay for them using your cryptocurrency. So kind of what happened is a dispute arises when a customer purchases a piece of digital art from this decentralized market, and the artwork does not match the description. So this is one of the cases where it's very difficult to kind of see where liability lies. Some people might say the buyer, some people might say the decentralized market, some people might say someone else entirely. In this particular case, a buyer demands a refund, but the seller refuses, and they're citing that the code is law of the smart contract that executed this trade, as well as the marketplace's terms of service. So these like are kind of the rules that are currently being followed. Any small regulations that are in place, whether it be in countries where there's a little bit more advanced like laws and regulations for Web3, but also a lot of different applications install their own laws of the service, and you can read those through the terms of service or whatever like other agreements that you have to use the app. And then kind of going more into this case study, the specific legal challenges of this decentralized market dispute is that determining legal jurisdiction can be very challenging. This is a challenge sometimes within the US when there's like people in different states kind of navigating that, but it becomes even more complex when individuals are residing in different countries and kind of having to bring the different legal jurisdictions together and decide what laws are applicable to a specific incident. So kind of figuring that out is a very complex legal question. And in this case, decentral market operates globally, and there's no centralized entity that kind of pinpoints it to a specific location. And the decentralized nature of this marketplace and kind of Web3 in general makes dispute like resolution very challenging, because it's hard to kind of pinpoint where a marketplace, an app kind of is and where this like took place, whether it be just like a dispute or fraud, etc. And also smart contracts being auto-executed and irreversible once executed makes it very challenging for someone to get their money back in a case of being scammed or there being fraud or unauthorized access. There's also the legal questions of the enforceability of the marketplace's terms. Is it always valid, depending on the jurisdiction? And whether or not the code is law argument for that smart contract is a valid argument. So kind of going more into the response. So the buyer then seeks legal action in their specific jurisdiction and files a complaint against the seller. And they're alleging fraud and misrepresentation because the digital asset they bought they didn't feel like it matched what they received. And the local court then issues a judgment in favor of the buyer, demanding restitution from the seller. Okay. Now we're going to kind of talk about the legal implications for this case study. This raises a lot of questions about can we enforce smart contracts? Can we enforce decentralized terms of service? Are they always like which one, I guess, is the final word? Is it based on the jurisdiction? Is it based on the terms of service? And this really highlights the tension between kind of the core component of blockchain's immutability as well as traditional legal recourse. Because traditional legal recourse is very much centralized. It's very much based in identity and being able to pinpoint different details, as well as the jurisdiction and laws applicable in a case. And different regulatory authorities in the future will probably scrutinize Decentraland in this particular instance and other similar platforms for more consumer protection to make sure that people are getting what they buy, and it kind of matches up with the description and what services and goods are given, as well as making sure there's not fraud going on these types of websites. It looks like someone asked, what are the Web3 general data protection issue clauses with respect to writing a smart contract for the blockchain industry? I think essentially the issues with smart contracts in relation to GDPR kind of regulation is just the right to delete your data at any point, the right to be forgotten in the EU, as that's pretty at odds with how the blockchain data structure works. And kind of moving on finally to the lessons within the case study that we learned, Web3 projects need to provide a very clear dispute resolution in order to make sure that when things like this happens, there's conflicts, there's fraud, there's money laundering, making sure that users are protected and that the liability is very much, I guess, proactive before incidents occur. Additionally, both developers and users of Web3 products need to be aware of the legal implications of their decentralized system, both specifically of their particular decentralized app, that network, as well as kind of in general. Also, decentralized platforms need to be able to balance their code-driven principles with legal and ethical responsibilities, because these products can only be implemented and only become kind of a new norm for the internet if we're able to follow kind of protocol in a way that values kind of people first and the collective, which is at the very core of Web3, is making sure that the power kind of shifts from the institutions that have historically held them into the users of the internet, essentially. If we're not focusing on the users of the internet, the developers, the coders, it kind of leads back into just a kind of revamped version of the current internet. Okay, we're gonna have a break in a little bit, but I'm gonna look and see if there's any more questions. Do users have to manually agree, like a terms of service type thing, to smart contracts, or are they agreeing to it just by using, for example, blockchain? That will vary, I think, by different application, different smart contract. But I think most exchanges and most kind of decentralized apps kind of have a terms of service while you're making your account and while you're kind of executing trades. For the challenges for Global Hack Week today, you can go to the Discord or the link that someone just put in the chat to check into the stream. Someone also sent a link, so you'll just click in and sign on to the MLH site. Now, we're going to take a few minutes, stretch, grab some water, walk around. I know it's a lot of information, and I'll be back in a few minutes to kind of talk about the ethical aspects a little bit more, looking forward in the future of Web3. Okay, and we're back. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. It was like a lot of information, but now we're going to get started on kind of talking about the ethical considerations that we need for Web3. They kind of apply to technology in general, but we'll be applying them to specifically Web3 and cryptocurrency. So yes, okay. Here are the ethical considerations. So the first kind of ethical consideration we have is transparency and trust. I think this is a great step for technology in general to focus more on transparency, letting users understand kind of what their data is being used for, as well as the technology as a whole and kind of how it works. A lot of cryptocurrencies and other decentralized apps do a great job of having online documentation of how their specific products work and how you're able to code them yourself. In the case of Ethereum, they have very extensive kind of resources and documentation for learning more about Solidity and that kind of thing. This is pretty unprecedented for technology and kind of just data records as a whole, because everything is so publicly accessible and you're not able to change it. I think that this immutability and your ability to audit things on your own with the transparency can definitely enhance the public's trust and accountability of different technology companies and applications. I feel like a lot of times there's kind of a general distrust of the traditional institutions, such as a bank, a technology company, the government. And a lot of times that's due to the fact that there's not a lot of accessible information. But blockchain can, I guess, like make a difference and the accessibility and allowing average people to understand like how their data is being used in the technology as a whole. And this kind of ties into how decentralization reduces the reliance that we have on central authorities, and it fosters more of a trust kind of in each other and the other users of Web3, the developers, as well as just people in the general network, versus feeling like you have to place your trust into whoever is making the application. Kind of how this works technologically is that trustless systems rely on cryptographic algorithms instead of intermediaries such as those governments, large tech companies, banks, etc. This allows for more of the trust to kind of be placed in those smart contracts, like the general network as a whole, the miners, the people validating those different contracts, those different blocks in the blockchain. But if there are vulnerabilities in that technology, there's a data leak, someone's financial information is hacked, there's actual finances are accessed, that kind of erodes the trust and will lead people to want to kind of go back to those traditional governing institutions. But if there is an emphasis on the cybersecurity of these applications and just the overall data security, I think this is a great way to kind of instill trust in the larger community using the internet versus those larger governing institutions. Another thing about Web3 ethically is that digital accessibility is a very key issue here because Web3 has the potential to further or begin to close the digital divides. There's a few ways to interpret digital divides, both through kind of making sure there is inclusive design for those with disabilities, making sure that people who are colorblind are able to read your website because there's enough color contrast, making sure that screen readers and other auditory and visual assistants are able to be embedded in those applications if they don't already come with them. That could also be a great kind of piece to add to Web3, is making sure that things are accessible and adding those screen readers and other kind of assistive technologies into the technology as a whole. And kind of secondly, how Web3 can kind of work to close the digital divide is how it is uniquely positioned to kind of work with underserved financial markets and decrease those challenges that you need to transfer money internationally, open up bank accounts, and access your money in general. Because there isn't that kind of middleman in peer-to-peer transactions and other crypto transactions. It makes it a lot easier to open up that bank account, send money to family back home in a different country, and make accessing money easier for people who aren't as well served by traditional financial models. But making sure that this Web3 digital accessibility really reaches those underserved financial markets is only really possible with making sure that physical access to Web3 technologies is a priority. Someone asked, how can Web3 help with digital accessibility? I think that making sure that inclusive design is at the forefront, as well as making sure that we're really focusing on communities that have been underserved by previous iterations of the internet, as well as financial models when we're looking towards decentralized finance. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the environmental concerns that come along with Web3. I think a lot of people may know, based on the news or social media, that mining Bitcoin and Ethereum require a lot of substantial energy, both to make sure that the blockchain has consensus and data security, so there's no leaks. And these are for specifically proof of work blockchains. The mining hardware to mine Bitcoin, to mine Ethereum, has a lifetime. And once these hardware pieces have kind of like hit their limit, they're adding to additional e-waste, which we already have a lot of from the usage of laptops and phones. So that's just another thing to consider. And the carbon footprint of some of these blockchain networks exceeds entire nations. That's something to consider too, because that's not inconsequential for a digital currency to be kind of out using carbon compared to an entire nation. But in talking about the environmental concerns, shifting to a proof of stake blockchain, such as Ethereum, is a potential solution because it increases the energy efficiency, uses a lot less energy to create the POS blockchains like Ethereum. And kind of additionally, for these environmental concerns, adding a new environmental regulation will be needed specifically for crypto emissions because it functions in a way differently from existing carbon emissions that we are more familiar with, such as transportation, with cars, planes, food waste. And this new environmental regulation is starting to be brought up in US legislation. Senator Ed Markey introduced a bill in late 2022. I'll have a link to that. I thought it was pretty interesting, kind of learn more about what potential environmental policies will be implemented for crypto. And I think that kind of following the legal precedent and ethical precedent of different countries, that the countries with existing strict environmental regulations, strict data privacy regulations will likely be the first countries to pass kind of comprehensive regulation for these different issues. So now we're going to move on to a case study for ethical considerations. And this one is a DAO hack. So first, a DAO hack in this particular case study is a DAO that is one of the earliest high-profile projects built on Ethereum. It's a decentralized investment fund, and it raised over $150 million in Ethereum from investors in 2016. And kind of what happened in this particular case study is that a hacker was able to exploit a vulnerability in a smart contract, and they then siphoned off about 3.6 million Ethereum, which equates to about 50 million US dollars. And this kind of exposed fundamental issues in this particular DAO's code security, as well as a lack of legal resource for the investors and the people involved in the DAO. And kind of the legal challenges in this particular case is that there's not very much clarity on which specific legal jurisdiction this falls into, because the DAO operates globally and isn't necessarily tied to a specific country or a specific person. And in this particular case, Ethereum smart contracts are self-executing and irreversible. So, like recovering the stolen funds in this case will be very challenging, and the recourse and kind of like justice for this case will be like challenging legal questions. And then also there's the question of, was this hack theft? Was this hack fraud? Or was it just like a legitimate like exploit within the smart contracts code? It also, I guess, that question itself makes it challenging to place in traditional legal frameworks because so much of it is unclear and doesn't very clearly fit into existing legal frameworks, existing kind of laws and regulations. Moving on a little bit more to this DAO hack case study, the response is that the Ethereum community faced a very significant ethical and legal dilemma. They would be able to return the stolen funds if they performed a hard fork to reverse the hack. And this hard fork was very controversial in the community because there were members that wanted to kind of return those stolen funds, whereas a different group of people in the community rejected this hard fork on ideological grounds, and they didn't want to essentially to keep the integrity of the blockchain in this instance. And the legal implications of this case is that the hack highlighted the need for legal clarity and kind of dispute resolution mechanisms kind of to be set up in a preventative manner. So when you're setting up a DAO, when you're setting up an exchange to have these different kind of mediation tactics and procedures already in place, and thinking about the hypotheticals with people trained in law in many different jurisdictions. The legal status of smart contracts and whether code should be considered law is also like a very interesting question. Should the terms of service, should the smart contract be considered law in cases where there isn't any legal precedent for this case, whether it be a hack, an exploit, fraud occurring, or siphoning of money. And in this particular case, regulators began scrutinizing initial coin offerings and other token offerings more closely in kind of response to this, so that they're able to see just like more about the DAO as it's up and coming and able to spot these sort of exploits and incidents ahead of time. And some of the legal lessons that you can learn from this particular hack is the importance of rigorous code audits and making sure that before smart contracts are deployed, they're very like thoroughly tested for different use cases and looking for like the ways that code can be exploited, and kind of preventatively having technologists come in and run exploit tests as well, in addition to kind of the use case, but also how easy is it to break or exploit this code. And also following security assessments as well as responsible development. So not pushing out smart contracts, DAOs, or other Web3 technology before it's ready to be released to the public, before the security is as tight as it needs to be. And it really highlights the need for regulatory guidance for these different incidents, is both for kind of what a DAO is in legal terms, as well as compliance for emerging blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies within the decentralized finance space. So before we move on to the resources and kind of learning more about Web3, I was curious what y'all thought about this particular case study. Do you have any opinions about how these kind of exploits should be handled before clear kind of legal frameworks have been set up? Someone said better communication, and I think that's a pretty good point overall for technology regulation and a lot of these case studies. I think that more technologists need to kind of be partnering with lawyers and other um, like other government officials making regulations, that we have a better idea of what could go wrong, as well as just like what the technology is as a whole. Someone else said perhaps the case is breaking all three of the laws and not just one or the other. That's also a very interesting question too. I think that that could also be a possibility as we create these legal frameworks for decentralized finance to charge incidents like these under multiple counts of crimes or incidences, to kind of see which one it most closely aligns with, and kind of following the process for all three of the laws and seeing which one makes the most sense, or maybe multiple apply in that particular instance or incident. Okay. Now we're going to move on to some resources. So it looks like in the comments there was a lot of discussion, a lot of questions, and a lot of people who were curious about how to learn more about Web3 and just about cryptocurrency in general. So here I have some overview links for Web3. So just like an overview of what Web3 is. There's a cypherpunk overview. If you remember earlier, I talked about that being the organization that was the first to kind of bring cryptography out of military use in the 90s, as well as the Bitcoin white paper, when the technology and purpose of Bitcoin was kind of outlined by the founder, who was anonymous at the time. There's another link that explains the difference between Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3 in pretty clear terms, and the differences and kind of how they can be applied to what we know now, what we have known in the past, and what we'll know in the future, as well as some more in-depth information on consensus mechanisms and the technology behind that. There's a few questions. Don't worry about the links. I'll be sending this out after the stream is over in the Discord, so you'll be able to access all the slides, and these links will be embedded in the slides. It looks like there's another comment about the case study. This particular person is located in the US, and they're concerned that the government is starting to work on taxing crypto. They think that they want to make money off of Web3. I think that's a pretty accurate representation of the regulation for that. A lot of governmental organizations want to be making their tax dollars on different things as they become legal, and kind of more into the mainstream. I think it's very interesting as we kind of see like how these different digital assets and cryptocurrencies will be taxed, if they'll be viewed as a currency, as a stock, as an investment, as an art in some cases. Someone else said that we also might need more testing, hacking, and exploiting smart contracts as kind of a preventative measure. I also think that's a really good idea. Will be needed. Yes. How do you think AI will be integrated into Web3? I think it'll be integrated in like a lot of different ways, similar to like how it's being currently implemented in Web 2. I think the development is kind of, they're integrating AI kind of like alongside the blockchain execution. I think that potentially vulnerability testing, unit testing might be done by an AI. We'll also probably see different, I guess, like compliance measures might be done by AI after we have more data. I do think that AI will help with the kind of the transition into Web3, as it'll kind of reduce the burden to manually do all these tasks for building new technology. And I also do think that AI could be used to exploit these contracts and kind of test every given scenario in a lot quicker runtime. Someone said that they think that breaking these laws and regulations usually end up with a slap on the wrist, so not much of a real deterrent. I think it kind of depends on which jurisdiction they're in for these laws. I think like a lot of times companies or different technologies are caught breaking these regulations, or there's a massive breach or something. And and there's not much of a consequence. Maybe it's a minimal fine, and no real, I guess, initiative to make changes. But I think in other jurisdictions where there's stricter laws, um, the regulations will be, I guess, like more strictly enforced. But I think that's kind of across the board typical for these financial regulations, because with a lot of traditional financial models, there have been, I guess, like different institutions breaking these laws or regulations and not necessarily getting the enforcement that is probably required. And I think that as a whole is, I guess, more to do with the other, like the existing governing institutions than Web3 in particular. Kind of going off of that, here are the legal framework resources. There's an article that talks about are there any legal regulations in the US for crypto, and talks more about that. There's a specific article on KYC for crypto, so know your customer in crypto and kind of how decentralized identity could work. There's an article on Chinese crypto ban and the different, like how Binance's transactions are occurring there and kind of like how that's at odds with each other, what's going on there. There's an article on is the government even ready to regulate crypto? I've personally noticed in a lot of different hearings and overall that a lot of governmental officials and a lot of just governments at whole don't have, I guess, the technical knowledge and capacity to regulate technology as a whole, even like the issues we're facing currently in Web 2. So it's, I think, a valid question to ask, is the government ready to regulate this new and more complex technology? And then also, I have a link to some crypto case studies. If you were interested in the ones we went through in this stream, you can go through and read those and learn more about like kind of the hypothetical situations. Some of them are potentially real situations that have happened. This particular link is from the UK, so I think that that kind of hones in on specifically what jurisdiction the laws will be applied within. It could be different from where you're located. Okay. Someone said that in gaming, they typically release the game to find bugs, the users. Perhaps there could be paid user testing or some incentive to let companies send them out to find the problems. I think that's a really good kind of strategy, and I guess like using dummy or test data for these users to kind of poke holes in it and figure out what works, where the vulnerabilities lie, and what can be exploited. Okay, and here are some links for ethical considerations within crypto. There's one just about like ethical concerns in general. There's one about the good intentions of crypto and bad actors. This one kind of falls into with the fraud instances, terrorist financing, how cryptocurrency can be tied to human trafficking in some instances, as well as there is this other article about crypto assets and transparency. Oh, this is actually the Ed Markey Act that's been proposed in late 2022. And then also a specific article on cryptocurrency and how it's used in human trafficking, and how that will provide, that will prove to be a very challenging legal problem for those cases. Okay, so now we're going to move on to kind of just a general discussion. Feel free to drop your questions in general. I know there's been a good amount of questions so far, but also there's a few questions listed on the slide here. So feel free to drop like what you think the future of Web3 governance can look like. What ethics do you think are most important in the Web3 world? What do you think we need to be most cognizant of? And what do you think is currently missing from existing Web3 governance? Okay, someone clarified their comment I responded to earlier. I guess I was talking about how many ethical boards have been established since AI came to the forefront in the past year. So the ethics of AI helping more of the adaptation of Web3 move faster into mainstream. I think that's definitely a possibility. I think these ethical boards focused on technology, specifically in artificial intelligence, will likely kind of bleed into Web3 concepts and could help accelerate Web3 being adapted faster into the mainstream and might even be proposed as potential solutions for kind of data privacy and other issues that arise with AI. Someone says they don't think it's going to be a huge impact or transition in our daily lives from Web 2 to Web 3. It would kind of be a regular adaptation where people won't notice much. It would kind of become a new norm. I mostly agree with that. I think that as we continue to kind of innovate with technology, we're going to have kind of eras of technology and the internet. It'll be kind of become our new normal. And I think the changes will also kind of take place at a rapid rate, but slow enough that we get used to them at like a kind of understandable and like normal pace. So aspects of Web3 will be kind of implemented into your day-to-day life, and you'll start using maybe a decentralized app, or crypto will be more widely taken as like a currency. Someone asked how to implement and integrate Web3 technology, norms, and standards into the conventional Web2 project app. I think that's a lot of kind of Web3 development. I don't think too much of kind of the software development process as a whole differs because you're still trying to follow kind of the usability guidelines. You're trying to make an app that makes sense for your users. It's just the data structures that are kind of varying. And I think just like a very simple thing that Web2 apps and kind of modern internet applications can embed is transparency. A lot of companies and apps do this now where they have open source code for different applications or services, as well as documentation on how to implement the technology, how the technology was built, and other questions. And I think that kind of as a natural step to that, the transparency with implementing more blockchain data structures will follow. Okay, someone says that they think it's going to be a mix of community voting and automated rules, ethics wise. Being transparent and inclusive is key. Right now, what's missing is a clear legal guide and making sure everyone, not just the tax savvy, can have a say. And so it's definitely promising, but has gaps to fill. I completely agree. I think that making sure that the users are as much as a part of building Web3 as a developers is really important because less technical people will be able to see and kind of highlight issues in the technology and the usability that developers and more technologically literate people will be able to won't be able to see as easily. So I definitely think a balance is definitely key to making sure that Web3 is really for the collective, for the people. Um, Someone said that they're worried about accessibility for websites in Web3. I think that's definitely a pretty valid concern, as a lot of technologists developing Web3 can be maybe more focused on the blockchain technology versus the accessibility of their apps and how you're able to embed kind of those existing accessibility tools such as a screen reader or auditory assistance. But I think that being able to make apps where that's able to be embedded, as well as maybe even having it embedded to begin with, is really important. Someone is still trying to grasp the idea of Web 3 and 4. So they utilize AI and machine learning to manage parts of their algorithms and how we interact with the Internet of Things, who develops some of their data, who holds responsible if an error occurs that nobody foresaw. So essentially, the idea of Web3 is more just the internet being owned by the collective of users versus a specific individual or institution. And kind of the question we've been grappling with legally and ethically this whole time is who is accountable if an error occurs that no one foresaw or a specific developer didn't foresee, and kind of implementing those regulations into the Web3 space. Can I use Google accounts or mainstream tech in Web3, like using Google accounts to sign up, etc.? I kind of see using mainstream technology within Web3 as kind of a transitionary phase thing. I think that maybe some apps, like for decentralized apps, might use like Google sign in or something like that in the beginning, but I don't think we'll use that for very long as relying on the institutions, like the big tech companies, is kind of looking to be phased out in Web3 and having more data decentralized. Are there any existing organizations that are utilizing blockchain effectively? On how? There definitely are. I think there's like a lot of different like exchanges that are using blockchain effectively. There's a lot of different decentralized apps that are using them effectively. I think it's just more of, I guess, like an adoption and kind of making sure that these apps are secure. I think that they're pretty solid in like ideation. It's more, I guess, execution, like adoption. Someone else in the chat sent a link to an article on how Web3 is empowering a disability movement. That's really interesting. I'll have to check that out after the stream. And then someone else, they like the idea of users being owners of Web3, but they can't see it happening realistically. They think that the governments or companies will figure out a way to gain ownership somehow. I think that's definitely a valid concern, and I think in some ways will happen with kind of the regulation that governments are starting to impose on decentralized finance and Web3 as a whole. But I think like maybe that the power will shift from being governments and like the large companies into more control of the people, and like in hand with those kind of regulations, even if it isn't, I guess, as fully decentralized as the original idea of Web3 was. But I guess it's always possible that the power still remains in the hands of like kind of like the collective internet versus those institutions. Someone asked about the slides. I'll be sharing those after the stream ends in the Discord, so just watch out for that attachment. And you'll be able to go back to all these links, kind of go over the case studies and any notes that you missed, because I know it was like a decent amount of information. Someone said to have proper rules and regulations, it kind of has to be in the hands of government and companies. I think to some extent I agree, but I think that because the government, I guess like the government regulations and like the concept of Web3 are so at odds, I think it'll be a very, I guess, like different sort of regulation once it's fully fleshed out. So it won't, I guess, fully be in the hands of government, but maybe I'm just being a little bit optimistic in that case. And when the regulations are more robust, it will, I guess, look more similar to what we have in Web 2, but with new data structures. How is Web3 different than crypto coins? I'm assuming you mean cryptocurrency. So essentially, cryptocurrency is kind of a concept within Web3. Web3 is kind of like how the internet will look as a whole when more decentralized apps and just decentralized concepts are applied to the internet as a whole. And cryptocurrency is kind of a more specific aspect within finance. It's a pretty it's like more of a hot topic than other aspects of Web3 and more of the mainstream outside of technological circles, just because of like the complex legal questions that e-currency and the data structures bring to financial regulations. Yes, someone said crypto is an application of Web3. That is true. Awesome. If anyone has more questions, feel free to drop them. But otherwise, I'll send the slides out in a few. Awesome. Thank you all so much for listening. It was really great to have such a good conversation with everyone about Web3 and kind of the legal and ethical considerations of it. I think it's a really interesting topic because it's so complex and there's so many different kind of aspects to it. So I love getting to talk about it with different people, answer questions, and just kind of learn more about different perspectives and different opinions on this. Thank you, everyone. I'll send out the slides in the Discord. Make sure to register at the link and have a great rest of your Global Hack Week.